heavy curtains of Highgate Manor swayed gently in the early evening breeze, the soft hiss of the wind merging with the distant caw of a raven perched atop one of the many craggy trees that loomed over the estate. The mansion was an imposing structure of grey stone, ancient yet eerily elegant, perched atop a hill where fog often gathered, blanketing the grounds like a shroud. It was the kind of place where secrets festered, where the old family lines whispered of curses and betrayals, long past. Inside the manor, a sense of tension was palpable. The grand drawing room, with its ornate furniture and fire crackling in the hearth, was quiet. Too quiet. It had been 2 hours since Lord Ashford had been found. He had been discovered slumped in a chair by the window, a faint smile on his lips, his eyes wide open in shock and disbelief. His body was cool, untouched by the flames in the hearth, and there were no obvious signs of struggle. It was as if he had simply died in the middle of a conversation. But there was something else, something more unsettling. Near Lord Ashford's body, lying on the Persian rug that covered the floor, was a small piece of paper. It was creased and torn, as if it had been hastily discarded. A single word had been scrawled on it in dark ink, the letters jagged and uneven. Tomorrow. It was an unusual clue, as enigmatic as the crime itself. The family gathered anxiously in the room, whispered among themselves in hushed tones. Lord Ashford had been in perfect health. No one could understand what had happened. They'd been present at dinner moments before, all of them, and none had noticed anything out of the ordinary. It was not long before Miss Marple arrived. The elderly woman had been summoned immediately by the local constable, who knew better than to attempt solving the mystery without her insight. Her reputation preceded her, after all. Miss Jane Marple, an unassuming woman with an uncanny ability to untangle the most perplexing of cases. She entered the room with a soft, deliberate step, her eyes scanning the surroundings with careful attention. Her expression was serene, but her mind was already at work. The scene was strange indeed. The manor, though grand, exuded a sense of disrepair, as if it had been left to decay with the passing of time. Her gaze settled on the paper first. Tomorrow. It was the key to understanding what had happened here. She bent down to examine it more closely. There was no doubt that it was deliberate. The paper was stained with a small drop of ink at one corner, suggesting it had been torn in haste. But who would leave such an odd clue? Why not something more straightforward? The answer, Miss Marple suspected, would not be simple. "Tell me, was anything missing?" she asked, her voice steady, but carrying an air of quiet command. Lady Ashford, her face pale and gaunt, shook her head. "Nothing at all. We've searched his chambers and the study. No signs of foul play other than his death." Miss Marple nodded. "And was there anyone in the manor who had a motive?" "The family?" The question came from Sir Charles, Lord Ashford's nephew, a tall man with dark eyes that glinted with both suspicion and something else, resentment perhaps. "We've all been accounted for," Lady Ashford replied. "No one was out of sight, not for a moment. Everyone was present during dinner." Miss Marple's gaze flicked toward the window. "It's odd that such a calm man as Lord Ashford should die in this way. Could he have been poisoned?" "Cool." Family members exchanged glances. Sir Charles crossed his arms, his lips tight. "There's no sign of poisoning. We checked his food and drink after we found him." "That's good to know," Miss Marple mused. "Perhaps this is more than just a simple case of death. There's something." something that's been overlooked. The constable, standing by the door, shifted uncomfortably. "You think someone in the family did it, Miss Marple?" She glanced over at him, then back to the room. "It's always a possibility, but I believe this isn't a matter of simple motives. It's more complicated." With a deliberate motion, Miss Marple knelt beside Lord Ashford's body. Her eyes scanned his clothing, his hands and his face. His countenance was serene, yet there was something unnatural about the way he had died. He had not fallen from his chair. No sign of struggle marred his posture. It almost seemed as though he had been waiting for something. Her fingers brushed gently against the edge of the rug. A faint indentation caught her attention. Someone had stood there recently. But who? The family members were all seated in their respective places at the table, and none had been near the body when it was discovered. "May I see the rest of the house?" Miss Marple asked softly. The constable led her through the manor. They passed through cold, echoing halls and up winding staircases. Miss Marple's steps were light, almost unnoticeable, but her mind was sharp, tracking every detail, the way the light fell through the stained glass, the faint scent of dust in the air, the discarded books that lined the shelves like forgotten memories. Finally, they arrived at Lord Ashford's study. The room was dark, with heavy curtains drawn over the windows. A fireplace lay dormant, and the desk was cluttered with papers, but none of them appeared disturbed. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "What about his correspondence? Has anyone read his letters?" Lady Ashford stepped forward, her face drawn and tired. "There were no letters, not that we could find." "And the safe?" Miss Marple inquired, her gaze flicking to the corner of the room where a large, ornate safe stood. Sir Charles stepped up to the safe and turned the combination with ease, the heavy door creaking open. Inside were only a few neatly stacked files and a small ledger. Nothing unusual. Miss Marple's lips pressed together. Something was wrong. There was an unsettling stillness in the air, a quiet that suggested someone had tried very hard to erase traces of their actions. She turned back to the rest of the room, her eyes flicking over the walls, the bookshelves and the furniture. She stood still for a moment. "The paper," she said suddenly. "The message that says, 'tomorrow.' What if it's not just a message? What if it's a clue to something else, something that happened down tomorrow?" The family members exchanged confused glances. Miss Marple's smile was faint but knowing. "You'll see. The answer is closer than you think." And as she turned to leave the study, the silent footsteps behind her seemed to echo just a little, too loudly. The mystery of Highgate Manor had only just begun to reveal itself. The night settled over Highgate Manor like a heavy cloak, the fog thickening as it crept across the grounds, swallowing the silhouette of the estate. Inside, the investigation continued, though the murkiness of the situation weighed heavily on everyone involved. The constable remained by the door, doing his best to manage the mounting tension among the family members, while Miss Marple wandered through the room, lost in thought, as though the threads of the puzzle were slipping through her fingers. The family sat in a corner, exchanging uneasy glances. Sir Charles had become particularly restless, his posture more rigid than before, and his gaze darted constantly from one person to another. Lady Ashford's face remained pale, her eyes hollow from the grief, yet there was something in her demeanour, a slight tremor in her hand, a nervousness that didn't match her quiet exterior. It was then that Miss Marple's attention shifted to something small but curious, a tiny detail that had escaped the notice of the others. The cracked china teacup on the side table, one of a set she had seen earlier in the drawing room, had a faint smudge of dark ink near the rim. At first it seemed unremarkable, just a trivial imperfection on a teacup. But Miss Marple's keen eye caught something more, a clue hidden in the mundane. She stepped closer to the table, her eyes narrowing as she scrutinized the small smudge. It had not been there when she first entered the room. A slight shift in the room's temperature, the crackling of the fire in the hearth, it all seemed irrelevant until Miss Marple's mind began to connect the dots. "Constable?" Miss Marple said suddenly, her voice cutting through the murmur of the room. The constable straightened. "Yes, Miss Marple? I believe you've missed something." She gestured toward the teacup. "This was not here earlier, was it?" The constable approached the table, a furrow of confusion appearing on his brow. "I don't recall seeing it either." Miss Marple picked it up gently, inspecting the dark streak more closely. "This ink, it's fresh, just like the one on the paper," she murmured, then looked up. "But it's not quite right. Look at the way it's smeared. Whoever did, this was in a hurry." The family members turned toward the teacup, but their interest was only half-hearted. They had been worn thin by the uncertainty of the situation, their nerves frayed by the endless questioning and accusations. Sir Charles's eyes darted briefly to the cup, but quickly shifted away, his unease growing. "There's something more," Miss Marple continued. "Whoever did this wasn't just trying to leave a clue. They were signalling something, perhaps a message or a warning. Whoever wrote that note tomorrow didn't mean for it to stay hidden for long." She placed the cup down gently, her eyes sweeping the room once more. This time, her gaze fell on Lady Ashford. The widow's face was still, but her lips were pressed tightly together, her fingers twitching slightly in her lap. It was a small movement, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't paying attention, but to Miss Marple it was telling. "Lady Ashford," Miss Marple began softly, her tone as unassuming as ever. "You seem troubled." The widow looked up, her eyes wide, but quickly masked her expression with a polite, almost brittle smile. I'm sorry, Miss Marple, I'm still in shock. It's hard to think straight in such circumstances." "But you're not thinking straight, are you?" Miss Marple said, her voice still calm but laced with an edge of understanding. "You're pretending to be more distraught than you truly are. You're hiding something, but not in the way you think." The room went quiet, the silence heavy, with expectation. Lady Ashford's hands clenched in her lap, and for a fleeting moment Miss Marple caught the faintest flicker of alarm in the widow's eyes. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a mask of stoic grief. "I don't know what you mean," Lady Ashford replied, her voice trembling just a little. Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned her attention to the rest of the room. Her eyes flicked over the furniture, the various objects that cluttered the space. The portrait of Lord Ashford above the fireplace, the half-empty brandy decanter on the side table, the books scattered on the chair by the fire. Nothing seemed out of place, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was being deliberately hidden. And then, as if in response to her thoughts, Miss Marple's gaze locked on an odd detail. A small, faintly red stain near the corner of the rug beneath the table. It wasn't large, but it was enough to make her pause. The stain was not consistent with the kind of damage one might expect from an ordinary spill. It was too deliberate, too purposeful. She moved closer, squatting down beside the rug to examine it. Her fingers brushed over the stain, a faint warmth, lingering in the fabric. The stain was old, not fresh, and it had been carefully covered with an object, a chair perhaps, so that it wouldn't be noticed. But now it was unmistakable. "This is blood," Miss Marple said, almost to herself. The constable hurried over, his face tense. "Are you certain, Miss Marple?" She nodded. "I'm sure, but this isn't the first clue you should be focusing on." She stood up slowly, her eyes now fixed on Lady Ashford. "It's the teacup, the ink smudge, the stain here. Together, they form a sequence. The question is not why Lord Ashford died, but how, and who stood to gain from it." Lady Ashford's face grew even paler, her lips trembling. She stood, abruptly excusing herself. I must rest." But as she moved toward the door, Sir Charles stood quickly, blocking her path. "No one is leaving, not yet. We must finish this," he said, his voice strained, almost desperate. Lady Ashford's expression faltered for just a second. Her eyes flickered to the door, then back to Miss Marple. There was something else in her eyes now, a flicker of fear. Miss Marple smiled, not in malice, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew a truth others hadn't yet seen. "I think we're getting closer. The message, tomorrow, wasn't just a warning. It was an invitation. It's only a matter of time before the real story comes to light." The family members stood frozen, watching as the room seemed to close in around them. The tension was palpable, and Miss Marple knew the answer was just out of reach, but it was there, hidden in the details, in the unspoken gestures, in the misplaced objects. Tomorrow, it seemed, would bring everything into focus, but by then it might be too late for one of them. The following morning, the air outside Highgate Manor was thick with mist, rolling across the lawns like a slow-moving tide, swallowing the stone pillars and wrought iron gates. Inside, the atmosphere was no less oppressive. The entire household had gathered in the drawing-room, a subdued silence hanging heavily over the group. Miss Marple stood by the window, gazing out at the grey expanse, her mind unravelling the tangled web of the previous evening's discoveries. Each member of the household had arrived one by one for questioning, summoned by the constable, who now paced restlessly at the centre of the room, his nervous energy apparent. He had been instructed to follow proper protocol, but Miss Marple knew the true work had only just begun. The family sat in stiff, uncomfortable chairs, eyes shifting between one another, as if unsure whether they were suspects or witnesses. Their faces were drawn, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, but there was something more, a tension that ran deeper than mere grief. Each of them had something to hide. Sir Charles was the first to speak, his voice steady but laced with an underlying impatience. "Miss Marple, I must insist that this farce end. We all know my uncle died in his sleep. There is no mystery here." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to him. There was something in his tone, too smooth, too controlled. He was trying with every word to direct the conversation, to steer the focus away from the events of the previous evening. "But why?" "Of course," she replied calmly, her voice cutting through the tension. "But I believe there's more to uncover, Sir Charles. You mentioned last night that everyone was present during dinner. Were there any unusual conversations? Anything out of the ordinary?" Sir Charles straightened in his chair, his fingers tapping nervously on the armrest. "Nothing unusual at all. It was a simple, quiet dinner, just as it always is. My uncle enjoyed his meal, and we spoke of nothing more than the weather and some trivial family matters. Nothing that would warrant suspicion. Miss Marple gave him a thoughtful look. Yet here we are, a dead man, an unsettling clue, and an ink stain where it shouldn't be. But let's not focus on your uncle's death just yet, Sir Charles. Let's speak of something more recent. You've been here since last evening, have you not? Sir Charles's jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. Yes, I've been here since the night before. I'm not a fool, Miss Marple. I know how these things work. You think someone in the family did it, don't you? There's no need to jump to conclusions, Miss Marple replied, her voice still even, though there was a slight edge. But you seem eager to avoid any questions. I'm simply asking, who stood closest to Lord Ashford in the moments before he died? Sir Charles paused, then forced a chuckle. You make it sound like I'm the murderer, Miss Marple. I'm not. Miss Marple held up a hand, silencing him. I didn't say you were, Sir Charles, but you were the last person to leave the drawing room before the body was discovered. Was there something you saw? Something that made you hurry to the study? Sir Charles's eyes flared for a moment, but he quickly masked it with a casual smile. I left early to work on some papers in my room. There's nothing more to it. I don't know how else to explain it. Miss Marple mused, glancing at him for a moment longer before turning her attention to Lady Ashford. The widow had been quiet, almost too quiet, sitting with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze distant. Lady Ashford, Miss Marple said, her voice kind yet probing. You were very close to your husband. It must be difficult to lose him so suddenly. Lady Ashford blinked, a slight tremor in her hands betraying her calm exterior. Yes, it's difficult. It was sudden. Too sudden. Miss Marple watched her closely. You were with him during the dinner. I understand you didn't leave his side much. Lady Ashford nodded quickly, too quickly. Yes, of course, we were together the entire evening. It was a quiet night. Nothing of note happened then, nothing strange. Miss Marple's question was casual, but her eyes were sharp. Lady Ashford's eyes darted briefly to the corner where the fire crackled softly. Her lips parted as though to speak, then closed again. No, nothing strange, she replied at last. But there was something in her voice that sounded forced, a slight break in the smoothness of her delivery. The hesitance was brief, but noticeable, like a slip of the mask she had carefully constructed. Miss Marple's attention turned toward the younger member of the household, Eleanor Ashford, Lord Ashford's niece. She had been sitting apart from the others, her legs crossed tightly and her hands folded in her lap as though to control any nervous gestures. Her face was pale, but her eyes were sharp, intelligent and wary. Eleanor, Miss Marple said, you've been rather quiet. Do you have anything to add to the conversation? Eleanor looked up, startled, as if the question had caught her off guard. She quickly composed herself, but the effort was too noticeable. I don't understand what's going on, Miss Marple. I wasn't with my uncle. I didn't even know he'd passed until I was called in this morning. And what about last night? Miss Marple pressed gently. Where were you during dinner? Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap. I was in my room. I wasn't feeling well. And did you see anyone on your way to your room? She hesitated for just a moment before shaking her head. No. No, I didn't. Miss Marple studied her for a long moment. Eleanor's nervousness was evident, but there was something else. A tightness in her shoulders, a subtle shift in her gaze. The lie wasn't in her words, but in her body language. Miss Marple wasn't yet certain what it meant, but she knew it was significant. "Thank you, Eleanor," Miss Marple said softly, before turning her attention to the final person present, Edward Fenton, Lord Ashford's longtime friend and business associate. He had remained largely silent through the proceedings, but his eyes never left the floor, as if the weight of his thoughts was too heavy for him to share. "Edward," Miss Marple said, her tone warm but firm, "you've been quiet. Perhaps you could tell me about last night." Edward looked up slowly, his face weary and haggard. "There's nothing to tell," he muttered. "I was sitting here for a time speaking with Lord Ashford, and then we parted ways. I went to my room to read, but I didn't see anything unusual. I didn't hear anything." "And did you see Sir Charles leave the drawing room?" "Missed you?" Marple asked, her voice cool. Edward's eyes flickered. "I suppose. I don't recall. I wasn't paying much attention." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow but didn't press him further. She knew when to let a comment hang in the air, when to allow the discomfort to settle, like a weight no one could ignore. The group fell into an uneasy silence after the questioning ended. Each person was left to stew in their own thoughts, yet Miss Marple sensed that none of them were being entirely forthcoming. The contradictions were beginning to pile up, small ones at first, easily overlooked, but they were there, lining up like stones on a path that Miss Marple was determined to follow. One by one, the witnesses had shown her something. Sir Charles's eagerness to explain away the evening, Lady Ashford's forced calm, Eleanor's barely hidden anxiety, and Edward's inattentiveness that seemed to mask something more. There was deception in the room, thinly veiled but unmistakable. The question was not who had a motive but who had something to hide, and Miss Marple, though patient, was beginning to feel that the truth was closer than ever. Yet the deeper she probed, the more uncertain she became. One of them was lying. Of that she was certain. But which one? The days following the questioning grew more unsettling. Highgate Manor, once a sanctuary of wealth and calm, now felt like a pressure cooker, each member of the household simmering under the tension. Miss Marple, though outwardly as calm as ever, was privately constructing a labyrinth of possibilities. The more she pieced together, the more tangled the web became. She had spent the night poring over her notes, snippets of conversation, subtle movements, half-truths that lingered in the air like shadows. The inconsistencies were glaring, but no single motive seemed to fit perfectly. There was greed, certainly. Lord E. Ashford had been a wealthy man, and his estate would pass to the rightful heir. But no one had seemed to benefit outright from his death. No, it was more complicated than that. Miss Marple stood by the fire, her thoughts shifting back to Lady Ashford. There was something about her forced composure, the way she had smiled, through the grief as though it were a mask too tightly applied. Her reaction to Miss Marple's questioning was telling. She had been so quick to assure everyone that everything was normal, yet her unease was palpable. Could it be that Lady Ashford had finally had enough of the marriage? Was there another man in her life? The thought was an uncomfortable one, but not an impossible one. Then there was Sir Charles. His eagerness to explain his actions, almost too eager, suggested a deeper need to divert attention away from himself. His position as the nephew, the one closest to Lord Ashford in age, made him a likely candidate for inheriting the estate. Had he been impatient for his uncle's death, wanting to speed up the inevitable? But there was something more. The crack in his calm demeanour, the flicker of something darker behind his words, made Miss Marple suspicious. He was hiding something. But was it murder? Or was it a secret that might bring him closer to the inheritance? Eleanor Ashford was a mystery in her own right. Her carefully constructed story about being alone in her room seemed plausible at first, but Miss Marple wasn't convinced. Eleanor was too intelligent, too aware of her surroundings to miss the small details that had slipped past the others. Her nervousness, more than simple grief, felt calculated, as though she had been trying to keep her distance from the others. Was she afraid, or was she simply waiting for something to happen? And then there was Edward Fenton, a long-time friend of Lord Ashford's and someone who had been very present throughout the investigation, yet always on the periphery. Miss Marple had observed him closely, his constant fidgeting, the way his eyes darted nervously whenever the conversation turned to the night of the murder. He claimed to have been reading in his room, but Miss Marple had a suspicion that he knew more than he was letting on. But what did he stand to gain? His relationship with Lord Ashford had never been one of heirs and inheritances, so what could his motive be? Miss Marple's mind turned over the possibilities, searching for any link that might tie the suspects together. In a quiet moment, as the household settled for the evening, she ventured out into the gardens, hoping to clear her thoughts. The fog had rolled in again, creeping over the hedges and across the gravel paths, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows. It was there, amid the quiet of the garden, that she encountered a figure she had not expected. Edward Fenton was walking briskly, his coat buttoned tightly against the chill, though he didn't seem to notice the cold. He was alone, and as soon as he saw Miss Marple, he stopped abruptly, a flicker of panic crossing his face before he masked it with a nervous smile. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight. "I was just taking a walk. The night is calm." "Isn't it?" Miss Marple studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing. "A walk, Edward? At this hour?" He shifted uneasily. "I couldn't sleep. There's too much on my mind." Miss Marple tilted her head, considering. "You don't seem like the type who would be easily shaken, but I suppose anyone can be undone by grief, especially when it's so sudden." Edward's face tightened at her words, and Miss Marple saw the briefest flash of something in his eyes. Guilt? Fear? Perhaps both. "You're wrong, Miss Marple." I'm not shaken." Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced down at his hands, noting the way they trembled slightly at his sides, betraying his calm words. "It's a difficult thing, losing someone close to you," she said quietly, her voice soft with understanding, though her mind was sharp, searching for cracks in his facade. "But there's more to this, isn't there?" He swallowed, his throat working. For a moment, Miss Marple thought he might say something, but instead he turned abruptly and walked away without another word. She didn't chase him. There was no need. She knew instinctively that she had just touched upon something deeper than grief. It was as though a door had creaked open in his mind, but he had slammed it shut just as quickly. The encounter, however, had given Miss Marple something to consider. Edward Fenton was not just shaken by the death of his old friend. There was something about the death that unsettled him on a much more personal level. He wasn't just mourning the loss of Lord Ashford. He was afraid of something that tied him to the manor, to its people, to the events of the night. Back inside the manor, Miss Marple found herself growing more and more certain that the tangled web of motives was not just a product of greed or jealousy. It was fear that held the key. Fear that someone in this house was not just trying to cover up a crime, but was desperately trying to prevent something far worse from coming to light. The following morning, Miss Marple gathered everyone in the drawing room once again, her sharp gaze sweeping over each of them as they filed in. Sir Charles sat in his usual chair, his posture too stiff to be natural. Lady Ashford had an air of quiet defiance about her, as if she were bracing herself for something. Eleanor seemed distant, as though trying to withdraw into herself. Edward appeared on edge, his eyes constantly darting around the room as though expecting someone to leap from the shadows. Miss Marple didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice calm but firm. "The night of Lord Ashford's death, each of you had a reason to be involved, but not a single motive explains everything. I've come to believe that the truth lies not in what we can see, but in what we can't. You've all shown fear, some more obvious than others. Fear of what? What is it that keeps you all so bound together in this web of silence?" She paused, watching the reactions carefully. Lady Ashford's face paled ever so slightly. Sir Charles's hands clenched at the armrests. Eleanor shifted in her seat, suddenly alert. Edward Fenton seemed to stiffen, though his gaze never met hers. "I believe," Miss Marple continued slowly, "that someone here knows more than they've said. You all have reasons to be afraid, fear of what might happen if the truth is revealed. But it's that fear which I believe has created the motive maze. A maze we are close to solving." Each person in the room shifted uncomfortably. But Miss Marple knew now the tangled emotions were the key. The motive wasn't just about wealth or revenge, it was about the fear of a secret that could ruin them all. And soon that secret would be exposed. The days after Miss Marple's pronouncement were charged with an unsettling energy, a sense of anticipation that lingered in the air like the storm before the lightning. Highgate Manor had become a place of suspicion, where every glance, every hushed whisper seemed to carry the weight of secrets. Everyone had a motive, but the truth was still eluding her, dancing just out of reach, like a shadow at the edge of the light. Then, one morning, a breakthrough arrived. It came in the form of an unexpected discovery, something small but significant. Miss Marple had been going over her notes once again when the constable, a young man with an earnest face and a propensity for finding his way into trouble, arrived in her study, his eyes wide with excitement. "Miss Marple," he said, breathless, with news. "We found it. We found the murder weapon." Her brow furrowed slightly as she looked up from her notes. "The murder weapon?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, nodding vigorously. "It was hidden in the cellar, wrapped in an old cloth, a letter opener stained with blood. We believe it's the one used to kill Lord Ashford." Miss Marple didn't allow her expression to change, though a quiet knot tightened in her stomach. This was too convenient, too neatly tied up. A letter opener, hidden away like that, waiting to be discovered just when it seemed like they were running out of leads. The authorities were already abuzz with excitement over this new piece of evidence. It was just the sort of thing that could easily tie the crime up in a neat bow. The constable continued, oblivious to her growing wariness. "We're going to have a full examination of the blood, of course, but the marks on Lord Ashford's neck suggest this could be the weapon. It's all starting to make sense." The detective's mind raced. her instincts whispering that something wasn't right. It was too easy, too perfect. She had seen this before, cases that seemed to resolve themselves only to unravel once the dust had settled. This was a false victory, one that would lead to nowhere if they were not careful. "Thank you, Constable," she said, her voice calm, though her mind was already racing ahead, reviewing the evidence in her mind's eye. "I'll speak to the authorities about it." "You've done well." The constable left, his steps light with the triumph of a discovery, but Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the door long after he had gone. A letter opener? That was the weapon that had ended Lord Ashford's life. It seemed too obvious, too much like something out of a storybook. The weapon had been hidden in the cellar, a place no one had thought to search before. It was the perfect way to lead the investigation down a false path. Someone was trying to make it too easy. Her thoughts turned to the suspects. Sir Charles, who had shown so much eagerness to explain away every question. Had he planted the weapon, hoping it would settle the investigation in his favour? But then, why not simply dispose of the weapon altogether? It didn't fit. Then there was Lady Ashford, whose strained composure seemed to be cracking. Had she staged the discovery, using the weapon to deflect suspicion from herself? But no, she had been far too rattled to mastermind such a thing. The idea that she had planted the weapon seemed far-fetched. What about Eleanor? She had been in her room, the perfect alibi, but she had also been the one to avoid eye contact, the one who seemed to know too much. Could she have known the weapon's location? Or perhaps, like the others, she was trying to cover up something bigger than a simple crime of passion. Edward Fenton remained the most enigmatic. There was no direct link to the murder weapon, but his fear, his discomfort in the face of so many questions, lingered. His quick departure from the garden that night had been telling. And yet, the weapon was found in a place no one had suspected. Could Fenton have been involved, or had someone else planted it there, playing a careful game with the authorities? As she sat in the study, contemplating the various possibilities, Miss Marple's mind shifted back to the day of the discovery. The authorities were already preparing to declare the case closed. They were eager for a solution, any solution, that would end the growing tension and restore some semblance of order. The constable had spoken about the blood analysis, and the urgency in his voice was unmistakable. When the news broke that afternoon, it spread through the manor like wildfire. The case was solved. A murderer had been found. The authorities were confident in their findings, ready to arrest one of the household members based on the discovery of the letter opener. But Miss Marple wasn't ready to let the case go so easily. The evidence was too convenient, too neatly tied up. She knew from experience that the initial breakthrough was often the most dangerous. In her mind, the letter opener was nothing more than a red herring, an attempt to mislead them into thinking the case was over. The constable, eager to please, arrived in her study again later that afternoon, his face glowing with triumph. "Miss Marple, it's done. The blood matches. We've found the killer." She looked up from her desk, her eyes calm but sharp. "Have you? How certain are you?" "Very certain, ma'am. The blood sample from the letter opener matches Lord Ashford's perfectly. It's a clear match." Miss Marple did not respond immediately. Instead, she rose from her chair and moved toward the window, looking out at the grounds of the manor, her mind churning. It was a victory, yes, but a hollow one. Something wasn't right. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, the creeping doubt that had followed her since the discovery of the weapon. "What about the prince?" she asked, her voice quiet, but laced with a quiet force. "Were there any prints on the letter opener?" The constable paused, his face faltering. "No prints, ma'am, but the blood is the real evidence. There's no denying it." Miss Marple's gaze hardened, and she turned back to face him, her mind focused now. "And how do we explain the lack of prints, then? How do we explain the fact that someone took such care to hide the weapon but left no trace of themselves behind?" The constable opened his mouth to speak, but then faltered, unsure. Miss Marple's instincts were right. This wasn't as clear-cut as it seemed. A professional would know how to wipe a weapon clean, how to remove any trace of themselves. But someone who was in a hurry, or too nervous, might leave evidence behind, something that could tie them to the scene. She stared at the constable for a long moment, then said, "You've made a mistake, I'm afraid. This is not the solution. It's the beginning of a new chapter." The constable's face fell, confusion spreading across his features. But the blood, Miss Marple, the blood matches." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, her voice cool and decisive. "But we need to ask ourselves a few more questions. Why was the letter opener hidden? Who had the opportunity to plant it there? And why was it so neatly concealed, as though someone was trying to make it seem like a simple murder?" The constable hesitated, then nodded slowly. "You're saying it's too easy?" "Exactly," Miss Marple said, a quiet certainty settling over her. "This isn't the answer. The murderer is still among us, hidden behind this false victory. The question is, who stands to gain from keeping us focused on this breakthrough?" She turned toward the door, her mind already racing with the next steps, her thoughts clearing like the fog lifting from the gardens outside. The criminal was still in the shadows, and Miss Marple was determined to bring them into the light. The days following Miss Marple's quiet dismissal of the letter opener as the murder weapon passed slowly, with an unsettling calm hanging over Highgate Manor. The authorities were reluctant to reconsider their conclusion, but Miss Marple knew that the discovery was too neat, too perfect a conclusion for such a complex and enigmatic case. The real criminal, she felt, was still out there, hiding in plain sight, carefully manipulating the investigation. Miss Marple had spent much of her time in the library poring over old papers, records, and documents that seemed unrelated. She had a peculiar habit of returning to the past when a case seemed impossible to crack. History, after all, often had a way of catching up with the present. The manor's history was well documented in the estate archives, and Miss Marple, her mind sharp and unyielding, hoped there might be something, anything, that might tie together the various threads of suspicion that had so far eluded her grasp. As she shuffled through the old letters, she came across a forgotten piece of correspondence, tucked between a pile of estate ledgers. It was a letter from Lord Ashford's early years, before his marriage to Lady Ashford, and it was addressed to a man Miss Marple had never heard of, Gregory Templar. The name rang no bells in the context of the current investigation, but the letter itself was striking, a letter written with a certain urgency, as though the writer were trying to cover something up. Lord Ashford spoke in vague terms about a disagreement between them, a debt that had been left unsettled, and a promise to never speak of it again. There was something in the tone of the letter that made Miss Marple pause. She had seen enough to know when there was more to a story than met the eye. The name Templar was hardly a common one, and it stuck in her mind like an odd piece in a puzzle that was missing a crucial edge. Could the unresolved conflict mentioned in the letter somehow be linked to the events unfolding at Highgate Manor? It seemed unlikely, but Miss Marple was not one to ignore even the smallest of clues. The past had a way of resurfacing, especially when secrets were left unchecked. Without delay, she set out to learn more about Gregory Templar. He had not been a part of the household in recent years, but he had once been a close friend of Lord Ashford's, so close, in fact, that Miss Marple found mention of him in the old guest books dating back to the late 20s. Templar had been a regular guest at the manor, particularly in the years before Lord Ashford's marriage. The pair had shared many interests, from politics to hunting to their shared financial investments. But then there was a break in the records, a gap in correspondence between the two men that suggested a falling out. That gap was exactly when the letter had been written. Miss Marple's curiosity turned to the Ashford family's other connections. She visited the village records next, searching for any mention of Gregory Templar or his whereabouts after his estrangement from Lord Ashford. What she uncovered was, as always, unexpected. Templar had disappeared from the social circles after the argument with Lord Ashford. According to a local innkeeper, Templar had been seen leaving the village in a hurry, but no one knew where he had gone after that. There was, however, a small note in the margin of the inn's guest ledger that caught her attention. It was dated 2 years before Lord Ashford's death and written in a hand Miss Marple recognised. It was Eleanor Ashford's handwriting. She had been a young woman at the time, newly married to Lord Ashford, but the note, quick and seemingly innocent, hinted at a visit she had made to Templar's estate. Why would Eleanor have gone to such lengths to visit a man with whom her husband had once had a falling out? And what was the true nature of their relationship? As she pieced the details together, an unsettling connection emerged. Eleanor Ashford had not simply been a witness to Lord Ashford's past. She had been a part of it. She had known Gregory Templar, and the two of them had shared a connection that went far beyond mere acquaintance. Miss Marple's suspicions grew. Eleanor's nervousness during the questioning was no longer just the tremors of grief. She was hiding something far more dangerous, something that was wrapped up in the history between her, Lord Ashford, and Gregory Templar. It wasn't just Eleanor's involvement that was now in question, but the possibility that Templar, despite his disappearance, had a much larger role to play in the unfolding drama at Highgate Manor. Had the long-forgotten conflict between him and Lord Ashford somehow resurfaced? Was Templar somehow responsible for the murder, or had he been an unwitting pawn in a deadly game? Miss Marple took her findings to the authorities. There was scepticism, of course. They were more than content to hold on to the theory that the case had been solved. The letter opener, they insisted, was conclusive evidence. But Miss Marple remained unconvinced. She could see through the surface. There was too much hidden beneath. The truth was not in the present, not in the letter opener, but in the shadows of the past, in the secrets that had been buried long ago. The authorities, still clinging to their false victory, were ready to dismiss her theory as a wild tangent. But Miss Marple pressed on, her resolve steely. She had one more question to answer. Was Templar still alive? And if so, where was he hiding? The search for answers took her to London, where she tracked down an old acquaintance, a former detective who had once worked with Templar in his youth. The man was a retired investigator now, living in a small flat above a bookstore. His name was Percy Greaves, and when Miss Marple mentioned Templar's name, his face went pale, his hands trembling as though the mention of the name alone had brought back long-forgotten fears. Templar, Greaves muttered, looking over his shoulder, as though afraid someone might be listening. I never thought I'd hear that name again. Templar's gone, vanished years ago, but he was a dangerous man. He had debts that could make a person do terrible things. And Lord Ashford, well, they had a history. Greaves leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Eleanor Ashford was involved with Templar long before she ever married Lord Ashford. She'd come to London sometimes, always in secret. They had an arrangement. Miss Marple absorbed the information, in silence, her mind working swiftly. It was beginning to fall into place now. Eleanor had not just been a passive bystander in her marriage. She had been an active participant in a dark, long-buried history involving Gregory Templar. But the real question was this: what had happened to him? Was he alive? And had he returned to Highgate Manor to finish what he had started so many years ago? Miss Marple's instincts told her that the shadows of the past were not finished with them yet. The case was not merely about a murder. It was about secrets long hidden, debts left unpaid, and an unresolved history that still held the keys to the truth. And soon, Miss Marple knew, the time would come when that history would catch up with the present, dragging the real killer out of the darkness. Miss Marple's mind hummed with the growing realization that the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but only just. The subtle tension between Eleanor Ashford and Gregory Templar, the veiled history of their relationship, and the long-buried conflict with Lord Ashford, it all pointed to something far deeper than a simple murder. But still, the true motive, the real spark that had led to Lord Ashford's death, remained just out of reach. There was one avenue Miss Marple had yet to explore in full, something that had been lingering in her thoughts ever since the authorities had made their premature breakthrough with the letter opener. She had always believed that the key to solving a mystery often lay in testing the reactions of those who had something to hide. And so far, the suspects had been content to sit back and let the investigation take its course. They had either assumed the case was solved or, perhaps more insidiously, had been waiting for the authorities to tie it up neatly and leave their lives undisturbed. But Miss Marple knew better than to take the surface at face value. In her experience, it was the unspoken details, the smallest shifts in behavior, the briefest moments of hesitation that betrayed the truth. The day after her conversation with Percy Greaves, Miss Marple found herself once again at Highgate Manor. She had an idea, a test, one that could provoke a reaction from the household that would reveal more than words alone could. It was an unorthodox approach, but in her long career, Miss Marple had learned that sometimes the most unconventional methods yielded the most telling results. She had arranged for a small dinner with the suspects, Lady Ashford, her daughter, Eleanor, Sir Charles, and Edward Fenton. The others had been kept busy with the ongoing search for Templar's whereabouts, leaving these four to occupy the manor. Miss Marple knew this was the perfect moment to put her plan into action. As the evening drew near, she made sure to arrive early, greeting each of the suspects with her usual composed demeanor. She was a woman of gentle words and quiet observation, and in many ways it was this very quality that made her such an exceptional detective. Her presence, though unassuming, was enough to unsettle those who thought they could hide their true selves behind a mask of politeness. The dinner table was set, and the evening began with the expected pleasantries. Sir Charles, as always, was the first to take the lead in conversation, his voice booming in a way that seemed meant to fill the room with authority. But Miss Marple, for once, was more focused on the atmosphere than on the words themselves. There was a palpable tension in the air, a strained civility that hung between the guests like an invisible thread. It was a dance of politeness, but each of them, Miss Marple could feel it, was trying to keep their own secrets locked away. As the main course was served, Miss Marple did something unexpected. She casually placed a small, carefully folded letter on the table. An innocuous thing, seemingly unrelated to anything of importance. It was an unmarked envelope, one that had been addressed to Lord Ashford, but with no return address or stamp. No one had seen it before, and yet Miss Marple's placement of it on the table seemed to make the letter stand out all the more. "Do any of you recognize this?" she asked, her voice soft, but carrying enough authority to make the question linger in the air. "I found it in the study earlier today. It was tucked away in the back of an old drawer, almost as if it had been deliberately hidden." Everyone at the table paused, their conversation faltering at the unexpected intrusion. Lady Ashford, her eyes narrow and wary, was the first to glance at the letter, her gaze flicking over it quickly before she turned away, almost as if the sight of it caused her discomfort. Eleanor, seated beside her, hesitated longer, her fingers absent-mindedly curling around her wine-glass. It was a small thing, but Miss Marple noticed. The way her hand tightened around the stem of the glass, the way her face betrayed a brief flicker of recognition. Sir Charles, ever the boisterous one, cleared his throat before speaking. "I'm sure it's nothing of importance, Miss Marple. It's probably just a bit of old correspondence." "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, her gaze steady. "But something about it seems different, doesn't it? The handwriting is unfamiliar, and the fact that it was hidden away makes me wonder who might have gone to the trouble of keeping it from view." The room fell silent for a moment. The sounds of the dinner table muted as the guests exchanged uneasy glances. Eleanor shifted in her chair, her posture suddenly rigid. Miss Marple could see it now. Her response, though subtle, was a sign that something deeper was at play. She had recognized the letter. There was no doubt about it. "Don't you want to know what it says?" Miss Marple asked, her voice low, but carrying just the right hint of curiosity. It wasn't an accusation, it was an invitation. An invitation to reveal more than they meant to. Eleanor's gaze flickered to the letter again, and for just a fraction of a second Miss Marple caught her breath. It was a look of panic, quickly masked, but still visible enough for Miss Marple to see. The letter had made its mark. "I'm afraid I don't," Eleanor replied quickly, perhaps too quickly. "It's probably just something trivial." Sir Charles let out a dismissive chuckle. Yes, nothing more than that. Let's not dwell on such things." But Miss Marple could sense the crack in Eleanor's composure. There was something there, a truth she was desperately trying to hide. It was as if the letter had been a trigger, a reminder of something she had tried to forget, or perhaps a reminder of something she had hoped to keep buried. Miss Marple allowed the silence to linger, watching as Eleanor shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Then, just as quickly, Miss Marple reached for the letter, as though she was going to examine it herself. But before she could touch it, Eleanor reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she grabbed the letter and shoved it into her bag. "I think it's best left alone," Eleanor said, her voice strained, the calm facade cracking. "There's no need to go digging up old things." The reaction was enough to confirm Miss Marple's suspicions. It wasn't the letter itself that mattered, but Eleanor's response to it. She had reacted exactly as someone would who had something to hide, something important. Miss Marple smiled inwardly. knowing that the game was now afoot in a way it hadn't been before. "I see," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but laced with a quiet determination. "Very well, Eleanor. But I think we can agree that some things have a way of coming to light when they are least expected." Eleanor's face flushed, and she glanced down at her lap, her hand still clutching the letter tightly. The room, once filled with the sounds of clinking silverware and polite conversation, now felt oppressively still. Sir Charles cleared his throat again, obviously uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. "Well, that's quite enough of this, I believe." But Miss Marple, ever patient, said nothing more. She allowed the room to return to its uneasy quiet, knowing that the seed of doubt had been planted. The real breakthrough was not in the letter itself, but in the reaction it had provoked. Later that evening, as the guests drifted off to their rooms, Miss Marple sat in the dim light of the drawing-room, her mind working through the pieces. Eleanor's reaction had been telling, revealing a crack in the careful facade she had built. But there was still much more to uncover. The letter had been a test, and the response had shown that Eleanor was not as innocent as she appeared. As Miss Marple sat there, pondering the implications of what she had learned, she knew the investigation had entered a new phase. The final pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, and soon the truth would be revealed, just as Eleanor's nervous hands had betrayed her in the most subtle way. The days that followed Miss Marple's quiet but pointed dinner with the Ashford household were filled with a slow, deliberate unravelling. Eleanor's subtle reaction to the letter had confirmed her suspicions. The young woman was hiding something, and whatever it was, it had the potential to change everything. The detective had always been cautious of the fragile nature of trust, but now, as she worked her way through the maze of secrets surrounding the Ashford family, she could feel the threads of deception tightening. Miss Marple had planned to continue her inquiries the next morning, to follow up on the lead she had uncovered, but fate had a different plan. She arrived at Highgate Manor early, as usual, seeking to begin a quiet day of observation. What she had not anticipated was the scene awaiting her. A flurry of activity as the manor staff hurried back and forth, the atmosphere thick with urgency. "Miss Marple, you must come quickly," a maid called to her from across the hallway, her face flushed with distress. "There's been a break-in, a terrible one." The detective's pulse quickened, but she kept her composure as she followed the maid to the study. The door to Lord Ashford's private study stood ajar, the lock hanging loosely as if it had been forced open. Inside, the room was in disarray, papers scattered across the desk, books knocked off their shelves. But it wasn't the dishevelled state of the study that caught Miss Marple's attention. It was what had been taken, or rather what seemed to have vanished. The letter opener, the very one the authorities had declared the weapon used in Lord Ashford's murder, was gone. And it was no mere coincidence. The placement of the desk's contents was too precise, too calculated. It was clear someone had intentionally targeted the letter opener, removing it from where it had been left, taking it as though to erase the last shred of physical evidence that tied the murder to the manor. Miss Marple's heart sank as she carefully examined the scene, her mind racing to put the pieces together. There was no sign of forced entry from the outside. The intruder had been someone with knowledge of the manor's internal workings, someone who could move unnoticed. The disappearance of the letter opener wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate act meant to sow confusion, to wipe away the last tangible clue that could link the crime to the perpetrator. For a moment, Miss Marple stood still, her eyes scanning the room with the kind of acute attention only a seasoned detective could possess. The crime was no longer a simple murder, but an active effort to bury the truth, and with it, the stakes had escalated beyond her expectations. "Who else had access to this room?" she asked, her voice calm despite the storm of thoughts rushing through her mind. The maid, her hands wringing with nervousness, glanced back toward the door, her expression tense. "Only the family, Miss Marple, and the staff, of course. But no one else came in here this morning, not that I know of." Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward the window, half drawn as the early morning light poured in. The intruder, whoever they were, had been bold, but they had also been careful. Whoever had stolen the letter opener had done so with knowledge that they wouldn't be caught in the act. "Is there any other sign of tampering?" Miss Marple asked, her mind already turning over the possibilities. The maid shook her head. "No. Just the missing letter opener. The rest of the room seems untouched." But Miss Marple could tell this was not the case. The subtle disturbances in the layout, the slight shifts in a pile of papers, the faint impression of fingerprints on a book cover, spoke volumes to her trained eye. Someone had been here recently, and they had worked to make it seem as if nothing was amiss. As the maid left to fetch the authorities, Miss Marple lingered in the room, her mind already piecing together the implications of this new development. The letter opener's disappearance was not merely an attempt to cover up the murder weapon. It was a calculated move to derail the investigation entirely. Whoever had taken it was working against her, trying to bury the truth before it could be uncovered. The question now was, who? She couldn't help but think of the dinner from the previous evening. Eleanor's quick, panicked reaction to the letter had not been a mere slip of the tongue. It was a sign of something much deeper, something she had been desperately trying to keep hidden. But what was it? And why was she so intent on hiding the truth? Miss Marple's train of thought was interrupted as the authorities arrived. Inspector Heathfield, a tall man with a perpetually furrowed brow, entered the room with a brisk stride. His eyes immediately took in the scene, the missing letter opener, the disarray of papers. He didn't say anything for a moment, choosing instead to take in the details. His sharp eyes locked onto Miss Marple, and she could feel his scrutiny as though he was measuring her every word. "We've had a development, Miss Marple," Heathfield said, his voice low, almost reluctant. "It seems the evidence we've been working with, well, it's gone, disappeared. This complicates things, doesn't it?" "It does," Miss Marple agreed, her voice steady. "But perhaps not as much as you think." Heathfield raised an eyebrow at her, clearly unsure what to make of her calm demeanour. "You have a theory, then?" Miss Marple's eyes flickered toward the open window, her thoughts now clear and focused. The missing letter opener isn't just a theft. It's a deliberate attempt to obscure the evidence. Whoever took it knew exactly what they were doing. And they didn't just want to remove the weapon, they wanted to erase a vital clue. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle in the room. The real question is, why take it now? What does this act reveal about the person who committed the crime? Heathfield looked around the room again, his jaw tightening. "We'll do our best to track it down, but this certainly makes things difficult." "Yes, it does," Miss Marple said, her mind already racing ahead. "But it also tells me something important. The killer is still here. They're among us. And they're doing everything they can to stop us from finding the truth." The inspector seemed taken aback by her unshakable conviction, but he nodded, already beginning to take note of the scene and the absence of the letter opener. Miss Marple, however, had already moved on in her thoughts, considering the family, once more wondering which one of them was hiding a secret so dark that they would go to any lengths to prevent the truth from surfacing. The stakes had been raised, and Miss Marple knew now more than ever that someone was playing a dangerous game, a game that would only grow more perilous as the days passed. The evidence had been erased, but the detective's resolve had never been clearer. She would find the truth, no matter the cost. And whoever was responsible would soon find themselves standing in the light, where no secret could stay hidden forever. Miss Marple spent the following days on edge. The missing letter opener, the sign of calculated deception, lingered in her thoughts. She had no doubt that the person who had stolen it was directly connected to Lord Ashford's death, but the discovery of that crucial evidence had only deepened the web of uncertainty. The authorities, of course, were scrambling to manage the situation. Inspector Heathfield, frustrated by the disappearance of the weapon, had begun questioning the household staff and anyone with access to the manor. But Miss Marple knew that, like most investigations, the search for the truth would be far more complex. What troubled her most was the growing sense that the killer, whoever they were, was still very much in control of the situation. They had already outmaneuvered the police once. She could feel it in the air. The stillness, the sense that something was being hidden right beneath her nose. Someone was deliberately playing this game in the shadows. It wasn't long before the truth came crashing in. The sound came as a shock, loud, desperate, and unmistakable. A scream. It rang out through the manor in the dead of night, high-pitched and filled with terror. Miss Marple, ever the observer, had already been up, unable to sleep, as the mystery gnawed at her. But this was something entirely different. She was already on her feet before the scream had fully echoed through the halls, her mind racing as she made her way down the dark corridor to the source. The sound had come from Eleanor's room. The door was ajar when Miss Marple arrived, her heart pounding in her chest. She hesitated for only a moment before entering. Inside, the scene was nothing short of chaos. Eleanor was standing near the window, her face pale and trembling, her hand clutched to her throat as if she were trying to suppress a scream that had already passed. Her eyes, wide with terror, darted about the room as if seeking something, anything within her reach that might offer comfort or protection. "Miss Marple," she gasped, her voice barely audible, shaking with fear. He was here. He came in and I don't know what happened." The detective stepped carefully inside, noting the open window, the fluttering curtains that had been disturbed, and the disarray of Eleanor's once neat room. A large, dark shape on the floor caught her attention, something that had been thrown aside in haste. It was a chair, knocked over with force, its legs jutting out at odd angles. On the floor next to it was a broken glass, its contents spilled across the carpet, a trail of liquid staining the fibres. But it wasn't the glass that held Miss Marple's attention. It was the unmistakable scent of fear, and the subtle, almost imperceptible signs of a struggle. "Tell me what happened," Miss Marple said, her voice calm, even though her mind was racing. Eleanor swallowed hard, her face contorting in distress. I was sitting by the window, just staring out, trying to—" She stopped, her voice breaking. "I heard something, a noise from the hall, then the door. It opened. I didn't see anyone at first, but I heard the floor creak. And then when I turned, there he was. He came right at me." "Who came at you?" Miss Marple asked gently, her eyes narrowing in concern. She could already guess what Eleanor meant, but it was important to hear it from her lips. The man. The one who killed Lord Ashford? Eleanor stammered, her face twisted with horror. I don't know how, but I just know it was him. Miss Marple's heart sank as she took in the girl's reaction. Eleanor was clearly traumatized. But there was something else in her words, something unspoken that troubled the detective. The certainty with which Eleanor spoke of the murderer was chilling, as though she had known all along who was behind the crime. Had she seen something? Or was she merely playing the part of the victim in a game far darker than Miss Marple had initially realized? And then? Miss Marple prompted, carefully stepping closer, her gaze fixed on the room's details. Her mind was already at work, piecing the puzzle together. I don't know. It all happened so quickly. The door slammed open and the man lunged at me. I screamed, I swear I screamed, but no one came. I don't know what he wanted. He just stood there, watching me. And then, suddenly, I was alone again. Just like that. He was gone. I don't know how. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with uncertainty. Miss Marple knew something wasn't right. Eleanor's frantic account didn't quite match the scene before her. No sign of an intruder's footprints leading away from the window. No lingering trace of the would-be attacker in the room. Eleanor had been alone when the scream had echoed through the manor, yet there was no sign of struggle that could explain how the intruder had slipped away so quickly. "Eleanor," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but piercing through the girls' hysteria. "I need you to think carefully. Did you hear anything else? A sound? A footstep? Any noise at all?" Eleanor's eyes darted nervously, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she saw a flicker of something. Perhaps a flash of guilt, or fear, hard to tell, but it was gone just as quickly. I don't know, I don't remember." Eleanor's voice faltered. I felt like I wasn't alone. And then I was. But it doesn't make sense. You have to believe me. He was there." Miss Marple paused, taking in the girl's words, studying her face. The subtle hesitation, the uncertainty behind her eyes. It was too much for the detective to ignore. Eleanor wasn't telling the whole truth. In fact, it was becoming clear that Eleanor had been hiding something all along. The question now was whether she had been the intended victim or the orchestrator of something far more sinister. As Miss Marple turned to leave the room, her mind was already beginning to piece together the new unexpected twist. Eleanor's account had rattled the foundations of the investigation, but it also pointed to something darker. Someone else who had been waiting in the wings, someone who had orchestrated the entire sequence of events with cold precision. And somewhere out there, the real criminal was still lurking. But this time, Miss Marple was ready. The game had changed, and she was no longer the hunter, but the one being hunted. Miss Marple left Eleanor's room with a heavy heart, her mind swirling with possibilities. The young woman's account of the encounter had unsettled her, but it also left too many questions unanswered. Eleanor's behavior was inconsistent. Her terror was palpable. Yet the scene itself suggested that nothing had truly happened, as she had described it. It didn't fit the pattern Miss Marple had come to expect, and the more she considered it, the more certain she became. Eleanor knew more than she was letting on. But one thing was becoming clear. The stakes had shifted. Whoever had taken the letter opener, whoever had set the course of these events in motion, was still very much in control of the game. And Miss Marple had a creeping suspicion that the next move was already being played out in front of her, invisible to the naked eye. The rest of the day passed in a blur. The police were notified, Eleanor was carefully questioned, and the staff were on edge, whispering in the hallways as they awaited further instructions. But Miss Marple had only one focus now: the pattern. Something about the way the events had unfolded was nagging at her, a sensation that there was a thread she hadn't yet pulled, but would, if she could just recognize it. It was during her quiet dinner that evening, sitting alone in the drawing room and reflecting on the earlier developments, that the breakthrough came. She had been going over the events again in her mind, replaying Eleanor's frantic words, the disturbing absence of evidence, the strange missing letter opener, the peculiar tension between the family members. She picked up her teacup, absent-mindedly swirling it as she pondered. Then, in a sudden flash, it hit her. The pattern. It was so simple yet so elusive. The clue that had been in front of her the entire time, buried beneath layers of distraction, now revealed itself in sharp clarity. It was the letter. The letter that had been discovered in the library, the one that had seemed so inconspicuous at first glance. The one Miss Marple had found tucked into the corner of Lord Ashford's desk, carefully hidden, but not out of place. It had seemed like just a minor detail at the time, a clue, yes, but nothing extraordinary. But now, in the quiet solitude of her thoughts, Miss Marple saw it in a new light. The letter itself wasn't just a piece of correspondence, it was a symbol, a deliberate act of misdirection. In her mind, Miss Marple ran through the letter's contents again. It had been addressed to Lord Ashford from an unknown source, written in a neat, practiced hand, with no clear indication of its significance. The letter had mentioned nothing overtly dangerous or threatening. Yet the moment it had been read, Miss Marple had noticed something strange, a detail that hadn't quite fit. The handwriting. It had been too familiar. Miss Marple had seen that style of writing before, though not in a place she expected. The neat looping script, the exacting precision, it was the handwriting of Eleanor. At first she had dismissed it as a coincidence, assuming that the letter had merely been placed among Lord Ashford's papers by mistake. But now, as she sat there, the connection between the two events seemed too strong to ignore. Eleanor had written the letter, and that meant, without a shadow of a doubt, that she was far more involved in the crime than anyone had realized. It was all coming together. Eleanor had been hiding something all along, and it had taken Miss Marple far longer than it should have to notice it. The letter, the missing letter opener, the strange encounter in the room, it wasn't just a case of coincidence. It was a pattern, carefully constructed and placed before her like pieces of a puzzle, waiting for her to assemble them. But why? Why had Eleanor written to her father in such a cryptic, indirect manner? And why had she so desperately tried to keep the truth hidden? The answers were out there, waiting to be discovered, and Miss Marple knew she was running out of time. She stood up abruptly, her mind now on fire with the revelation. The next step was clear. She needed to confront Eleanor, not with accusations, but with questions, carefully chosen to reveal the cracks in her story. Miss Marple's sharp eyes would not miss the subtle shifts in the girl's demeanor, the small details that betrayed her. As she made her way to Eleanor's room, the weight of the revelation settled over her like a heavy cloak. The girl was hiding something far deeper than fear. The question was, how far had she gone to protect herself, or, worse, to protect someone else? Eleanor was pacing nervously when Miss Marple entered, her face pale, eyes darting about the room as though searching for an escape. The room, like the rest of the manor, felt oppressive with tension, the walls closing in with each passing moment. "Miss Marple, you came to ask about it, didn't you?" Eleanor stammered, her voice unsteady. "About the letter?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied, her tone even. "I've been thinking about it. About the letter you wrote to your father, the one addressed to Lord Ashford." Eleanor froze, her hand tightening around the edge of her desk. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Miss Marple waited, her eyes never leaving Eleanor's face, watching for the smallest flicker of guilt or fear. "You wrote it, didn't you?" Miss Marple continued softly, though the weight of her words carried a palpable tension. "The handwriting matches your own." Eleanor's lips trembled, her eyes darting away. For a long, painful moment, the two women simply stared at each other, the silence stretching thin as the truth began to press upon the girl like an invisible weight. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I didn't want it, but he forced me to." Miss Marple took a step closer, her mind already racing ahead. "Who forced you, Eleanor? Who?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head, as if unsure how to explain the dangerous web she had spun for herself. I can't tell you. If I do, he'll come after me. He'll hurt me." The detective was undeterred. "Eleanor, the truth is the only thing that can protect you now. You must tell me everything, and I will help you." Eleanor glanced toward the door, her shoulders hunched as though she expected someone to walk in at any moment. Then, in a voice so low it was almost drowned out by the rush of Miss Marple's thoughts, she spoke. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. But now it's too late." Miss Marple waited, every instinct screaming that this was the moment when everything would fall into place. And then the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Eleanor's voice trembled as she spoke, but Miss Marple knew she had finally reached the heart of the mystery. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," Eleanor repeated, as though the words were meant to explain everything, but they only deepened the mystery. There was fear in her voice. Yes, but there was also something else, something that hinted at a hidden truth she had been struggling to suppress. Miss Marple stood silently for a moment, letting the weight of the silence fill the room. Her mind was turning over the pieces of the puzzle, each detail adding more layers to an increasingly complex scenario. Eleanor's fear was genuine, but it was fear of something far beyond a simple murder or inheritance. She took a deep breath, then carefully stepped closer to Eleanor. "Eleanor, the time has come to be completely honest," she said softly. "The longer you wait, the more dangerous this situation becomes for you. You must tell me what really happened, who forced you, what is the connection to your father's death." Eleanor's eyes shifted nervously, darting around the room as if she was afraid of being overheard. Her lips parted once more, but this time there was a strange hesitation, a sense that the words she was about to speak could not be easily undone. Finally, she spoke in a rushed whisper, her voice low and broken. "It wasn't my father. It was Lord Ashford." The name landed with an unexpected weight in the room, and Miss Marple froze, her heart skipping a beat. Eleanor had confirmed, something that Miss Marple had suspected but had not dared to vocalize. There was a hidden relationship between Eleanor and the late Lord Ashford that no one had known about. And this connection, this secret bond, had a significance far deeper than anyone had imagined. He wasn't just my father's friend, Eleanor continued, her voice trembling as though each word cost her something. He was more. She paused, visibly struggling with the words. I was in love with him, Miss Marple, and he felt the same way. Miss Marple's mind reeled. This revelation wasn't just unexpected, it was jarring. For all of her years of experience, for all the cases she had solved, this was an angle she had never anticipated. Eleanor, the young woman who had seemed so innocent and fragile, had harboured a secret, one that would have made Lord Ashford's death a far more complicated affair than anyone could have guessed. Lord Ashford loved you? Miss Marple asked gently, her voice quiet, but sharp with curiosity. And your father knew? Eleanor nodded, her face flushed with shame and sorrow. My father had no idea. He would have never allowed it. But Lord Ashford and we found ways to meet. We thought we could run away together. We even planned it. We were going to leave everything behind, start a new life. She swallowed hard, as though the memory was too painful. But then my father found out. It was clear now that the dynamics between Lord Ashford, Eleanor, and her father were far more tangled than anyone had realized. What had begun as a love affair had spiraled into a web of secrets, lies, and ultimately betrayal. But it still didn't explain why Lord Ashford had been killed. If they had been lovers in secret, why had he died in such a violent, brutal way? Surely Eleanor had no reason to kill him. Or did she? I couldn't let him expose us, Eleanor continued, her voice trembling as she wiped a tear from her cheek. I couldn't let my father ruin everything. Lord Ashford and we had planned to go away together. But when my father found out, he threatened to destroy him, destroy both of us. I was terrified. Miss Marple's thoughts were racing. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but there were still gaps, critical ones. The truth of why Lord Ashford had died, the role of the missing letter opener, and the strange events that had followed his death, all of it was beginning to form a disturbing picture. But the most critical element remained elusive. Eleanor, you need to tell me the whole truth, Miss Marple said, her voice steady but insistent. What happened the night Lord Ashford died? Did you have any part in it? Eleanor's face crumpled, and for a moment she seemed to lose her composure completely. She sank into the chair beside her desk, her hands shaking. I didn't mean for it to happen, she whispered. I just wanted to keep him away. I wanted him to leave us alone. He had gone too far, Miss Marple. He was going to ruin everything. I didn't know what else to do. So what did you do? Miss Marple asked quietly, leaning in ever so slightly, watching Eleanor's every move. I went to see him that night after my father had gone to bed. I thought I could reason with him, but when I arrived at his study, he was angry. He was furious at me for hiding the truth, for wanting to run away. He said I had no idea what I was risking, and that if I kept pushing, my father would never forgive me. We argued. It got worse. Eleanor's voice quivered, her words spilling out faster now, as if the floodgates had opened. I didn't mean to hurt him, but then he grabbed me. I didn't know what to do. He was threatening me. He was going to expose everything, Miss Marple. My father would have never forgiven me. I don't know what happened. It was a blur. I just reached for something, the letter opener, and I don't remember. Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly as the full horror of the situation dawned on her. Eleanor had killed Lord Ashford, but not with the cold, calculated intention of a murderer. It had been a crime of desperation, an act of self-preservation born from an overwhelming fear of exposure. Eleanor had been willing to go to any lengths to protect her secret love affair and herself from her father's wrath. But the murder, the brutality of it, was not the end of the story. It was just the beginning. Then what happened? Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle but firm. After you killed him, what did you do? Eleanor took a deep, shaky breath, and the full weight of what she had done seemed to crush her. I panicked. I didn't know what to do, so She stopped, her face a mask of horror. I hid the body. I tried to make it look like a break-in, a robbery gone wrong. I thought if I could make it look like that, no one would suspect me. I was wrong. I didn't think it through. The confession left a chilling silence in the room, and Miss Marple stood still, processing the revelation. The murder had been a crime of passion, a desperate act to protect a secret love. But Eleanor's fear had driven her to make a fatal mistake. The real story, the truth of Lord Ashford's death, was more tragic, more complicated than anyone had imagined. Miss Marple felt a deep sorrow for Eleanor. She had been pushed into a corner, driven by fear and love, and in the end, she had done something unforgivable. But the detective knew that the law must be upheld, no matter how sympathetic the circumstances. You will have to face the consequences, Eleanor, Miss Marple said quietly. But there is still hope for you. The truth is out now, and you must be prepared to live with it. Eleanor's head bowed in shame, and for the first time Miss Marple saw a flicker of something else in her eyes. Guilt, yes, but also relief. The weight of the secret had been lifted, and the truth, painful as it was, had finally come to light. As Miss Marple turned to leave, she glanced back one last time at the broken girl before her. The pattern had emerged, the motive revealed, and the case, though tragic, was finally on its way to resolution. Miss Marple sat in the dimly lit drawing-room of Highgate Manor, her gaze resting calmly on the shadows cast by the flickering fire. Eleanor had been taken into custody, her confession having laid bare the tragic story that had driven her to such extreme actions. But there was something still unfinished, something she couldn't quite shake, despite all the pieces seemingly falling into place. The revelation of Eleanor's motive, her desperate desire to protect a forbidden love, had been unexpected, but it wasn't the only truth Miss Marple sought. There had been too much secrecy, too many unanswered questions. The case was more than just a crime of passion. Someone had orchestrated too much, and someone still stood behind the curtain pulling strings. Miss Marple had been mulling over a singular, crucial detail, the strange, almost obsessive behavior Lord Ashford had displayed in his final days. His increasingly erratic actions, the cryptic conversations overheard by witnesses, the veiled threats he had made against Eleanor's father. Lord Ashford's own paranoia, his suspicion of betrayal, of being cornered, had led him to believe that there was more at play than anyone had realized. And so, when Miss Marple had spoken to the authorities earlier that morning, she had emphasized one thing above all. There was someone else involved, someone who had known too much, someone who had manipulated the events, planted the seeds of mistrust, and finally pushed Eleanor to commit murder in a fit of panic. The clock on the wall ticked steadily as Miss Marple waited for the final pieces to fall into place. She had set the stage for one final confrontation, and now She only had to wait for the trap to spring. As the door creaked open, a familiar figure entered the room, Reginald Blackwood, Lord Ashford's solicitor, the man who had been advising Eleanor's family since before her father's death. Miss Marple's sharp eyes studied him as he entered, his face drawn, his eyes cold. She could see the tension in his posture, the way he moved, quick, calculated, yet somehow too careful. He knew what was coming. "You wanted to see me, Miss Marple." Blackwood's voice was smooth, too smooth, like a mask slipping just beneath the surface of anxiety. "I trust you have no more questions. The matter is nearly concluded, is it not?" "Almost," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice calm and steady. "But I am afraid there are still a few threads to tie up, Mr. Blackwood." He stiffened, and Miss Marple noticed the subtle shift in his demeanour. The man had been nothing but courteous through the investigation, always ready with an answer, always eager to help. But now, as she looked at him, the facade had cracked, the calculated charm, the practiced calm. It was all slipping away. "You've been involved with this family for years, Mr. Blackwood," she continued, leaning slightly forward, her eyes never leaving his. "You've helped them navigate matters of wealth and business, but I wonder, did you help them navigate matters of love as well?" Blackwood's lips twitched, his fingers tapping nervously against the back of the chair. "I have no idea what—" "You mean Miss Marple," he said stiffly. "I've merely done my duty as a solicitor. There's no need to make this uncomfortable." But Miss Marple wasn't fooled. She had seen this before, the subtle signs of guilt, the shift from bravado to uncertainty. She had learned to read these things over the years, and Blackwood's reaction told her all she needed to know. "I see," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm. "Then perhaps you can explain why Lord Ashford had begun to trust you with his deepest secrets. Why, in the days before his death, he spoke often of betrayal, of someone who had forced him into a corner. Did you know about his relationship with Eleanor?" Blackwood's face tightened at the mention of Eleanor's name, but he said nothing. His silence was enough to confirm Miss Marple's suspicion. "You knew about it, didn't you?" she pressed. "You knew that Lord Ashford had been seeing Eleanor in secret, and that her father would have done anything to stop it. And yet you did nothing. Why?" The tension in the room thickened, and Blackwood's composure finally began to crack. His hands clenched into fists, and his gaze flicked toward the door, almost as if he were considering an escape. But there was nowhere to run. The walls of truth had closed in, and there was no place left for him to hide. "I knew," Blackwood admitted, his voice low and ragged. "I knew about their affair, and I knew what it could do to the family. But what you don't understand, Miss Marple, is that it wasn't just about love. It was about power. Power. Over everything. Over the inheritance. Over control. Lord Ashford had plans, big plans." Miss Marple nodded, her mind piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. She could see it now, the motivations behind Blackwood's actions. He hadn't been protecting Lord Ashford's legacy out of some misguided loyalty, or even greed. No, there was something deeper at play. The solicitor had been working with Ashford on a larger scheme, one that involved Eleanor, her father, and ultimately the wealth of Highgate Manor itself. "The money," Miss Marple murmured. "It was all about the money." Ashford knew that. With his death, Eleanor's inheritance would pass to her father, and Blackwood, you would be left in the cold. You couldn't allow that, So you manipulated the entire situation, made Eleanor believe she had no choice but to kill him. But why? Why go that far? Blackwood's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Miss Marple saw a flicker of panic in his eyes. He took a step back, his hand shaking as he spoke, voice rising in anger. You think you know everything, don't you? But you don't. You don't know what it was like, watching everything slip through your fingers. Ashford was a fool. He didn't see that I was the one who had been building the empire all along. He couldn't see that I was the one who deserved the wealth, the power, everything. But when he found out about Eleanor and me— Eleanor and you, Miss Marple interrupted sharply. You were in love with her too, weren't you? You saw an opportunity, and when Ashford discovered your affair, you knew it would ruin everything. So you took the only path left, making sure he was silenced. Blackwood's face twisted in fury. I never wanted to hurt her, but Ashford was too reckless. He was going to ruin everything I had worked for. And if that meant manipulating her, using her guilt to push her into a corner where she had no choice but to act, then so be it. She was the perfect pawn. Her love for him, her desperation, it all played right into my hands. Miss Marple stood up slowly, her eyes narrowing. And now you've trapped yourself. You thought you could control everything. Eleanor, Lord Ashford, the inheritance. But in the end, it was your greed that destroyed you. Blackwood's eyes flickered, with a moment of pure panic. Then, before Miss Marple could react, he lunged toward the door, his hand reaching for the handle. But as he turned the knob, the door swung open sharply, and two officers stepped into the room. They had been waiting just outside. Reginald. Blackwood, one of them said firmly, you're under arrest for the murder of Lord Ashford and the conspiracy to manipulate Eleanor Northcliffe into committing the crime. Blackwood froze. His body stiffened, his breath catching in his throat. There was no escape now. He turned back toward Miss Marple, his eyes wild with rage and disbelief. You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've done. You'll never understand. None of you will. Miss Marple's expression remained unreadable, her gaze steady as she watched him being led away. The tension in the room dissolved as the officers took him into custody. The final pieces of the puzzle had clicked into place, and justice would soon follow. Eleanor would face the consequences of her actions. But the true mastermind, the one who had orchestrated everything from the shadows, had been unmasked at last. Miss Marple had played her hand perfectly. The web of lies, manipulation, and power had finally unraveled. And now the truth was out in the open. As the door closed behind Blackwood, Miss Marple stood in silence, her gaze lingering on the fire as it burned low. The case was closed, but she couldn't help but feel a quiet, lingering sadness. Some puzzles, no matter how neatly they fit together, would always leave their marks on the soul. The case had drawn to a close, or so Miss Marple had believed. With Reginald Blackwood arrested and the truth finally revealed, there was a certain stillness that hung over Highgate Manor. Eleanor, although devastated by her role in Lord Ashford's death, had begun the difficult journey toward atonement. Her life, inextricably tangled with lies and manipulation, was to be rebuilt in the shadow of her mistakes. The authorities had gathered their reports, the news of Blackwood's arrest spreading like wildfire through the village. It seemed as though the world could now breathe easy again, as if the threads that had bound the community in fear and confusion had finally been cut. Miss Marple, however, sat quietly in the drawing room, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The room was bathed in the soft glow of the fading afternoon light, the fire crackling faintly in the hearth. But despite the comfort of the familiar surroundings, there was a lingering sense of unease in the air. Her mind would not rest. Something gnawed at her, a thread she could not let go. She'd thought the case was solved, black and white, clear as day. But now, sitting in the quiet of the manor, she felt the sharp sting of doubt. She had been wrong before, and the more she replayed the events in her mind, the more she saw gaps, small, almost insignificant things, but things that, in the grand scheme of an investigation, could not be ignored. Then, the unexpected happened. The sharp rap on the door broke her reverie. It was unusual for anyone to call at this hour, especially after everything had been wrapped up. She rose slowly, her eyes narrowing with the same sharpness that had guided her throughout the investigation. When she opened the door, a young constable stood there, his face pale with worry. "Miss Marple, there's been a development. We've found something. Something that doesn't make sense." The words were enough to send a jolt through her, and without another word, she followed him down the corridor to the small, dimly lit office where they had been handling the case's final paperwork. The officer was flustered, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled a small, crumpled letter from his jacket. "This was found hidden in Lord Ashford's study. It wasn't discovered in the initial search, but we found it just now, stuffed behind the old books on the shelf," he explained, holding the letter out to her. Miss Marple took it, her fingers brushing the faded paper. Her eyes scanned the neat, handwritten words that seemed at first glance to be completely innocuous. "The plan is set. Everything is in place. They'll never know the difference. Don't worry. I will handle it. It's too late now, and there's no turning back." The letter was unsigned. But as Miss Marple read it, a cold shiver ran down her spine. The words were chilling, their implications much darker than anything she had originally considered. There was no reference to any of the people already involved, Eleanor, Blackwood, or even Lord Ashford himself. No, this letter mentioned a plan that had been set in motion well before the death of Lord Ashford. Miss Marple felt her pulse quicken, her mind working furiously to make sense of the letter's contents. The casual reference to handling it and the certainty that there's no turning back were not words spoken by someone who had merely been involved in a single murder. They spoke of something larger, more calculated. A greater conspiracy was at play, and Miss Marple realized that, in the whirlwind of Blackwood's confession and Eleanor's remorse, she had missed something crucial. She had failed to see the deeper layers, the machinations behind the scenes. The mastermind wasn't Blackwood, and it certainly wasn't Eleanor. They were pawns, just like everyone else. No, there was someone else, someone whose involvement had been hidden in plain sight. As she folded the letter back into her hands, the constable stood quietly, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Miss Marple's expression was unreadable, her eyes narrowing in thought. The calm, gentle demeanor she had maintained throughout the investigation now seemed a carefully constructed mask. Beneath it, the sharp intellect she wielded like a scalpel had already begun to dissect the truth. "I need you to gather everyone," she said, her voice measured. "Everyone connected to this case. They're all still here, aren't they?" The constable nodded, though he seemed confused by her sudden urgency. "Yes, Miss Marple, they're still in the manor. Should I fetch them all?" "Yes," she said, her voice growing colder with each passing moment. "But no one is to leave until I've spoken with them." Without another word, the constable hurried off, leaving Miss Marple standing alone in the room, the weight of the revelation pressing heavily on her. The truth had been lying there, just out of sight, waiting for her to uncover it. It wasn't enough that Blackwood had manipulated everyone. There was someone else who had orchestrated the entire affair from the start. Someone whose power, whose control, had been hidden beneath the guise of innocence. Minutes later, the assembled group stood in front of Miss Marple, Eleanor, the officers, the remaining staff of Highgate Manor, and Lord Ashford's closest confidants. They were all there, waiting for answers, their faces a mix of uncertainty and fatigue. Miss Marple looked each of them over carefully, her eyes scanning their expressions with surgical precision. As she did so, a figure caught her attention. Sophie, the governess. Sophie had been a quiet, seemingly inconsequential presence in the background throughout the investigation. She had never once been a person of focus, yet something about her, some minor detail that Miss Marple had only recently noticed, triggered a deep sense of suspicion. Sophie stood slightly apart from the group, her hands folded in front of her with perfect poise. There was something too controlled about her expression, too composed for someone caught in the middle of such turmoil. Miss Marple's gaze hardened as she focused on Sophie. "I've been overlooking something," she began, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Something that none of you realized." Sophie shifted uncomfortably, but held Miss Marple's gaze. "What do you mean?" she asked, her tone polite but tinged with an almost unnatural calmness. "The letter," Miss Marple said simply, holding it up for everyone to see. "The one hidden in Lord Ashford's study. The author of this letter was someone with intimate knowledge of the situation at Highgate Manor, someone who knew exactly how to manipulate the events, to use Blackwood and Eleanor to carry out their will." She paused for a moment, allowing the tension in the room to build. Sophie's fingers twitched ever so slightly. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it did not escape Miss Marple's notice. Someone who knew Ashford's wealth was at stake. Someone who stood to gain everything once he was out of the picture. Miss Marple's eyes flicked back to Sophie, and she took a step closer, her voice soft but relentless. "You, Sophie. You're the one who set this all in motion. You are the true mastermind behind Lord Ashford's death." Sophie's face drained of colour, the composure slipping away to reveal the crackling terror beneath the surface. Her hand instinctively reached for her throat, her fingers clutching at the invisible weight of her guilt. "Yes," Sophie whispered, her voice breaking. "It was me. It was always me." Miss Marple stepped back, letting the confession sink. And Sophie, the quiet governess, had orchestrated the entire affair. Behind the calm facade, she had been driven by desperation, a need for power and influence that would come only through the downfall of Ashford and the others involved. The truth, as always, had been in plain sight. And now, at last, Miss Marple had uncovered the final twist of the tale. The silence in the room was palpable. Sophie's confession hung in the air, heavy with the weight of the truth finally uncovered. Yet despite her admission, there was an unsettling calm to her demeanour, a stillness that sent a chill through Miss Marple's bones. The quiet governess, the woman who had seemed so inconspicuous, had pulled off a brilliant deception. She had manipulated everyone, including the police, into believing Blackwood was the mastermind. when in fact she had orchestrated the entire web of deceit from the very beginning. Sophie's hands remained clasped tightly together, but her lips trembled slightly as she looked around at the assembled group, her eyes desperate, pleading for understanding. But Miss Marple wasn't fooled. She had seen this sort of thing before, an attempt to feign remorse, to plead for sympathy at the last moment. "Why?" Miss Marple asked softly, breaking the stillness. "Why go to such lengths?" Sophie's gaze flickered to the floor. Her breath was shallow, as though the confession had drained her of all the strength she had once summoned to hold everything together. "It was never about revenge," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It was about control. Lord Ashford held the key to everything I wanted, his wealth, his influence, his power. But he always saw me as nothing more than a servant. I was never meant to be in his world." She swallowed hard, her eyes locking with Miss Marple's. "I knew if I could remove him, I could have it all." The room remained silent, save for the crackling of the fire and the steady rhythm of Sophie's shallow breaths. Her confession, though detailed, was devoid of any true remorse, just the cold acknowledgement of a calculated crime. "Did you really think no one would notice?" Miss Marple continued, her voice steady, but with an edge of incredulity. "That you could hide your role behind the chaos of Blackwood's actions?" Sophie's eyes flickered. She shifted uncomfortably under Miss Marple's piercing gaze. "I thought if I controlled the narrative, if I manipulated the right people, the right moments, it would work. It almost did. And yet," Miss Marple continued, her tone shifting to something almost reflective, "you underestimated the power of observation. The things you thought would go unnoticed, the smallest details, the ones you never even considered, those were the ones that gave you away." Sophie shook her head, her hands trembling now, no longer trying to hide her fear. "I should have known. I should have known it was too perfect. I just didn't think anyone would look that closely." Miss Marple took a step back, her eyes never leaving Sophie's. She could almost feel the weight of everything Sophie had done, the lives she had manipulated, the lies she had spun, all to grasp at something she believed was rightfully hers. Everything. "Sophie," Miss Marple said, her voice growing colder, "came crashing down because of one thing, your arrogance. You thought you could cover your tracks. You didn't realize how closely I was watching." Sophie's lips trembled, her gaze darting nervously around the room. But Miss Marple's words seemed to strike deeper than anything physical. The governess had thought she was smarter than everyone else, playing her part in the shadows, controlling the stage from behind the curtains. But in the end, she had revealed herself too many times, too often, and Miss Marple had been there to notice. "But there's one thing you haven't yet realized, Sophie," Miss Marple continued. "The truth always finds its way to the surface. It doesn't matter how well you bury it. It's only a matter of time." Sophie's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, Miss Marple saw the full extent of her realization. The game was over. But it wasn't just the confession that unsettled Miss Marple. It was the strange finality of Sophie's tone, the way she had spoken, as though she were already prepared for this moment, perhaps even expecting it. "What will happen to me?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she had already resigned herself to her fate. The question was simple, but its implications sent a ripple of unease through the room. Miss Marple's sharp mind raced, considering the path ahead, for Sophie. She had confessed, and the authorities would undoubtedly take the necessary steps. Yet Miss Marple knew there was something even more crucial at play. Justice, in its purest form, could not always be neatly wrapped in a bow. Some truths, no matter how glaring, might be buried by those who could afford to silence them. "Don't know," Miss Marple said slowly, her gaze unwavering. "That is not for me to decide." Sophie blinked, her lips parting to speak, but no words came out. The realization had hit her with the full weight of its impact. She had no control over what came next. She had lived her life playing others, but now the game had shifted, and she was nothing but a pawn in someone else's hands. The authorities arrived moments later. The constable returned with a few senior officers, all of whom had been stunned by the revelation. They took Sophie away quietly, her fate sealed in their hands. Miss Marple didn't follow them. She remained. In the drawing room, her eyes still locked on the spot where Sophie had stood, her mind swirling with the realization of what had just occurred. The case had come to an end, or so it seemed. In the days that followed, as the authorities wrapped up the final paperwork and prepared for Sophie's trial, something unexpected occurred. A letter arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, its contents simple but chilling. "You were always one step ahead, but this isn't over. The truth is buried too deep, and I'll make sure it stays there." The handwriting was familiar, but it wasn't Sophie's. It was a reminder, one that cut through the calm of Miss Marple's satisfaction like a knife. The words, cold and detached, suggested that Sophie wasn't the only player in this game. There were forces still at work, waiting for the right moment to strike. For the first time since the investigation had begun, Miss Marple felt the faintest ripple of doubt. The case, though seemingly resolved, wasn't as finished as she had hoped. There were pieces missing, connections not yet made, motives still unexamined. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully, tucking it into her pocket. She had solved the murder, yes, but someone else had just raised the stakes. She wasn't done yet. The shadow that loomed over Highgate Manor had not disappeared. It had simply shifted into a new form, and Miss Marple, ever vigilant, knew it. Was only a matter of time before the full truth came to light. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the darkened manor, watching the last of the constables drive away in their carriages. The snow had started to fall again, soft and relentless, covering the ground with a fresh layer of white that made everything look eerily still. The world outside had grown quiet, as though holding its breath after the storm of events that had unfolded over the past few days. The air was crisp, sharp against her skin, but Miss Marple didn't mind. Her mind, as always, was sharper than any winter chill. As the manor's lights flickered out one by one, she felt the weight of the case lift from her shoulders, but not the sense of closure she had expected. Sophie had confessed. Blackwood had been cleared. The police were satisfied, and justice would soon be done. Yet Miss Marple's keen instincts told her that something was still amiss. She could still hear Sophie's voice echoing in her mind. The governess's last words, frail and defeated, had resonated in a way that unsettled Miss Marple. "The truth is buried too deep. I'll make sure it stays there." Was it just a final, desperate attempt to assert control over the situation? Or was there something more? Sophie had confessed, yes, but Miss Marple wasn't convinced that every thread had been pulled. There was a detail that lingered, just out of reach. A detail that had never fully made sense. The locked drawer in Lord Ashford's desk. When Sophie had been apprehended, Miss Marple had taken the opportunity to carefully examine the room, but the drawer had always been locked. At the time, she hadn't given it much thought. After all, Sophie had confessed to the murder, and everything seemed neatly tied up. But Miss Marple's mind rarely rested, and now she couldn't shake the feeling that she had missed something. Turning back toward the manor, Miss Marple walked slowly up the stone path. The shadows of the tall trees stretched long in the dimming light, their limbs twisted into strange shapes. She felt, for the briefest of moments, as though the house itself were watching her, its very walls holding secrets she had yet to uncover. The investigation had been exhausting. Sophie had played her role perfectly, her nerves, her confession, everything so meticulously calculated. Yet something about her behavior had always struck Miss Marple as odd. The governess's sudden, uncharacteristic outbursts of emotion when confronted about the missing letters, the way she seemed too eager to provide answers at the most opportune moments. It was as if she had been expecting to be caught, almost as if she were playing a part in a larger play. The mask had slipped too easily, and Miss Marple had sensed the faintest flicker of guilt in her eyes when the confession was offered. It was almost as though Sophie had hoped to end the charade herself. But why? Miss Marple felt a sharp pang in her chest, the instinctive knowledge that there was still something important lurking, hidden in plain sight. Her thoughts returned once again to the locked drawer. Could it be that Sophie wasn't the sole mastermind? Or had she been part of a larger scheme, with someone else pulling the strings from behind the scenes? A sharp crack of thunder interrupted her reverie, and Miss Marple stopped in her tracks. The wind had picked up, whistling through the trees, rattling the windows of the manor. She paused for a moment, listening to the eerie creak of the house, a sound that almost sounded like a sigh. She turned back toward the house, her eyes narrowing with purpose. It was time to revisit that drawer. Whatever secrets it held, Miss Marple knew they were the key to understanding the full truth of what had happened in Highgate Manor. As she entered the manor once again, the corridors seemed darker, colder. The faint hum of the fire in the parlour had long since died out, and all that remained was the hush of silence. Her footsteps echoed in the emptiness, an odd comfort in its predictability. She made her way to Lord Ashford's study, the scene of so many questions that had yet to be fully answered. The desk sat as it had been left, papers scattered across its surface, the chair pushed back slightly. The drawer, still locked, was exactly as it had been. Miss Marple approached it with slow, deliberate steps. There had to be something she had missed, some small detail that would explain Sophie's cryptic final words. A glint of light caught her eye from the corner of the room. One of the portraits that adorned the walls had shifted slightly, as though someone had brushed against it. She walked over to examine it, the fine brushwork of the painted frame now a little off-kilter. Miss Marple's hand brushed against the frame, and the picture suddenly swung open with a soft click. Behind the portrait, there was a small safe hidden in the wall. Her pulse quickened. So this was the secret Sophie had been so desperate to keep hidden. This was the truth that no one had known about, except perhaps for one person. Miss Marple quickly assessed the safe. It wasn't difficult to open, a simple mechanism that had likely been installed by the Lord himself, perhaps to hide important documents or treasures. Inside, the contents were sparse. A few letters, neatly folded and sealed with a wax stamp, and a small velvet pouch. Miss Marple lifted the pouch, her mind racing. What could it contain? She opened it with careful fingers, revealing a collection of delicate gold coins. Not just any coins, though. These were antique pieces, rare and highly valuable, coins that, if sold, could bring in a fortune. But why were they here, hidden away in a safe behind a portrait? As she examined the coins, something caught her eye, an inscription. On the back of one of the coins, it was worn, faded, but still legible. "To my dearest, forever and always." Her breath caught in her throat as the pieces began to fall into place. The coins had been a gift, likely from Lord Ashford to someone very close to him. But who? And why had they been hidden? Just then, a sound came from the hall, a soft tap at the door. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the sound, and her heart skipped. She had thought she was alone. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. It was Blackwood, looking as though he had just emerged from the shadows. His expression was unreadable, his eyes glinting with an intensity Miss Marple had not seen before. "Miss Marple," he said softly, closing the door behind him, "I believe you found something you weren't meant to." She met his gaze, her mind working swiftly. Could Blackwood have known about the safe? Could he have been involved in this secret after all? Before she could speak, Blackwood continued. "The case is not finished, Miss Marple. Not yet." Miss Marple's heart pounded as the realization hit. There was more to this mystery, something deeper still. She had solved the murder, but the hidden truths, those were just beginning to unravel. And somewhere in the depths of Highgate Manor, another secret still waited to be discovered.